We all strive to live a long, prosperous, and healthy life. With advances in health and medical sciences, this goal is ever more attainable. The Sam and Rose Stein Institute for Research on Aging is a nonprofit organized research unit under the auspices of the University of California at San Diego, committed to advancing lifelong health and independence through research, education, and patient care. To better empower and improve the lives of young and old alike, the Stein Institute presents the following program.
I'll be talking about successful cognitive and emotional aging, topic that clearly interests all of us. In the beginning, I'm going to briefly discuss what is successful aging. After that, I will present some of the studies that we have been doing here at UCSD at the Stein Institute for Research on Aging. After talking about our studies, I will discuss some biological, psychological, and social determinants of successful aging. Briefly talk about whether successful aging can occur in people with serious mental illness, like schizophrenia or major depression. And last but not least, will be discussion of neuroplasticity of aging and how do we all live up to aging successfully? What are the strategies? I will start with mention about this book written by Dr. Seuss, who, as you know, lived right here in La Jolla. And he wrote a book, fabulous book called You Are Only Old Once. And he called it a book for obsolete children. And this is how it begins. In those green pastured mountains of Fort Fuzzy, everybody feels fine at 103 because the air that they breathe is potassium-free and because they chew nuts from the ta-ta-ta tree. Now, even in this America's finest city, we don't have potassium-free air. And we don't have ta-ta-ta trees. So we need to find ways still about how to age successfully. In terms of usual aging, we know that the average life expectancy in the US is 75 years in men and 81 years in women. Just 100 years ago, the life expectancy was 45 years. So it's really an incredible increase in the life expectancy from 45 to now 75 in men and 81 in women. But we all know that the last few years of life involve some physical illnesses and disabilities. Things like arthritis, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, stroke, cancer. So there is something called health expectancy. How long would most people live reasonably healthy lives? And that is 67 years in men and 72 years in women. But that is the usual aging. And the usual notion that most people have about aging is that it follows a progressive downhill course. This is a quote from Shakespeare's As You Like It. He talks about 7 stages of life, starting with the infancy. And the last scene of all, he says, that ends this strange, eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans test, sans everything. But that's the usual notion, that as we get older, we lose everything, that old age is associated with disease, depression, dementia, disability, and finally death, all of those bad things. Is that really true? And that is sometimes true, but that's not always true. There is something that is successful aging, and of course I will talk about that the rest of my talk. But if you read the literature, you won't find much in the literature on successful aging. there are thousands of papers on aging-related diseases. Diseases like Alzheimer's disease, other dementias, cancer, heart disease. Very few on successful aging. Why is that? One is because the medical and research models focus on diseases and disabilities. As physicians, patients come to us with symptoms. We diagnose the disease and we treat it. Even as researchers, it is easier to do research on a disease. You become a cancer expert or schizophrenia expert, depression expert. So you can diagnose people with those diseases and conduct research. How do you conduct research on successful aging? There is no the definition of successful aging. Also, there is discomfort with soft science. We all read about these anti-aging remedies and fountains of youth, things like that, that really bring the whole field into disrepute. And last but not least, there is stigma against aging. Now, there are different kinds of stigmas. There is sexism, there is racism. But what is interesting about ageism is that this is something everybody buys into, including older people. That is because right from the beginning, we are brought up thinking that old age is bad news. And so when we grow old, people still have that notion in their mind. And that leads to pessimism about why waste resources, why do research in old age? And unfortunately, you see that even at the highest intellectual levels. A couple of years ago, a younger colleague of mine, Colin Depp, and I, we reviewed the literature on successful aging. As I said, in contrast to thousands of studies on age-associated diseases, we found 28 studies on successful aging. And between them, they had 29 definitions of successful aging. Just goes on to show that there is no the definition of successful aging. What is the most commonly used definition? Physical disease or physical disability. That really shows that most people think of successful aging as physically successful aging. If you don't have good physical health, if you have disease or disability, according to most people, you're not aging successfully. And the usual notion of successful aging is someone like this person, 94-year-old man who ran a marathon. Now, I can't run half a marathon. I think I'm going to wait till I'm 94 when I'm... It'll be nice to live up to 94 and then run a marathon. But really, how many of us are going to be able to do that? This is more at-home picture. This is from Los Angeles Times. This was an 89-year-old woman who went skydiving for the first time. Again, that is great, but how many of us are going to be in that perfect physical health that will be able to skydive at 89 and run a marathon at 94? To me, that is not successful aging. That is ideal aging. And ideal, by definition, is something most of us cannot reach. So, although that will be nice to have, it is very unlikely that most of us will go into old age without any diseases or disabilities. Does that matter, though? This is Franklin Roosevelt. I think most people will agree that FDR was one of the greatest presidents in the US history, and he spent most of his life in a wheelchair. He was struck with polio when he was 2 years old and was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. And actually, most people did not know that he was in a wheelchair, because at that time there was no TV, and he would give lectures sitting on a chair. But the fact is that in spite of physical disability, he was the president of the world's really largest democracy, the most important country at that time, during the time of the World War II. I think even more striking example is Stephen Hawking. He's an astrophysicist in UK, really one of the leading thinkers of our time. He has Lou Gehrig's disease, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. That disease paralyzes most of the muscles in the body. And he's not able to speak, write, feed himself. He has some minimal movements, but with computer technology, he can communicate. And so he can, quotes unquote, give talks. He can, quotes unquote, write. There are other people who, of course, convert his movements into writing and speeches. And as I said, he's really one of the major thinkers of our time, in spite of being so disabled physically. Goes on to show that physical disability does not mean one is aging unsuccessfully. And yet, most of the research has focused on physical diseases and disabilities. So we started a study 4 years ago. We wanted to find out what the seniors themselves thought, whether they thought physical illnesses were important, whether they thought cognitive aging or emotional aging was more important. So we did a study of a couple thousand seniors in the community. We started with a survey questionnaire. The first question in the survey questionnaire was, how do you rate yourself on successful aging on a scale from 1 to 10? 1 is worst, 10 is best. And everybody has to rate themselves. We did not give any guidelines about what is successful, what is unsuccessful. People had to decide for themselves. Then we wanted to find out how many of people met other criteria for successful aging. The slide I showed you earlier, I said there are 29 different definitions. So we looked at those definitions and found out how many people met those criteria. And then we wanted to find out what is it that made some people age successfully and not others. Was it their attitudes? Was it their health? Was it their activities? We also conducted qualitative focus groups, some individual interviews, and currently we are doing some brain imaging and other studies, and I will present some of these findings. So starting with the survey questionnaire, as I said, the first question was, how do you rate yourself on successful aging on a 1 to 10 scale? Then we also asked about the demographics, age, gender, ethnicity, income, education, medical history, illnesses, medications, health behaviors, things like smoking, drinking, substances, exercise. We use some scales for looking at quality of life, cognitive functioning, resilience, optimism, depression, and a bunch of different things. They were included in this survey. So we have data actually on about 3,000 seniors living in the community in San Diego. Some of them came from the local retirement communities. There are a number of retirement communities in La Jolla as well as the rest of San Diego. In addition, we collaborated with some of the large ongoing studies, especially the Women's Health Initiative. This is a very large study of tens of thousands of postmenopausal women done by NIH over the last 15 years. And at San Diego, there was one of the sites. We looked at people who are not institutionalized. In other words, not people in nursing homes or board and care homes. People living independently, but independent does not mean that they did not need help. Some of these people could be in wheelchair, but they did not need 24-hour assistance. Most of them were between 60 and 99 years of age, mostly white, with at least high school education and financially stable. So in some ways, our population was not totally representative of the US sample, but we needed to start someplace, and so that was a sample. The population was, however, representative in other ways. One thing we wanted to find out how these people did physically. So what this showed is comparison of our sample from the Women's Health Initiative study with the national sample. And we found that the two samples were practically identical in terms of physical disabilities like climbing one set of stairs. About a third of our sample over the age of 65 had difficulty climbing one set of stairs. Similarly, about a third of them had difficulty walking several blocks without getting breathless. And this is what you would expect in the general population over age 65. So these were not marathon runners. These were not mountain climbers. These were the average 65-plus year olds that we all are familiar with. That's important to keep in mind. Only 38% of them were free from disability. So 62% had some physical disability or another. Only 20% were free from disease. So 80% had diabetes, hypertension, arthritis, heart disease, cancer, stroke, one or more of those. What about mental illness? Fully quarter of these people, 25% of them, had been diagnosed or treated for some mental health problems sometime during their lifetime, usually depression or anxiety. And this is what you would expect in population in this age group. About a quarter of them would have a history of treatment for one of such mental health problems. Many of them had been prescribed medication. Very few of them had been hospitalized psychiatrically. So if I just told you that we studied these people aged between 60 and 99, average age was about 73, and number of them had physical illnesses and disabilities, and some of them had mental health problems. And I asked you to imagine what would their ratings be on successful aging. You remember I asked, the first question was, where do you rate yourself on successful aging from 1 to 10, 1 being worst, 10 being best? We thought, when we started the study, that probably most people would give themselves 3, 4, at the most 5, considering the physical problem they had. And we are really surprised that most people gave themselves 7, 8, 9, or even 10. The average score was 8.4. So there is something happening here. These are people with physical illnesses, physical disabilities, and yet they think that they are aging well, they're aging successfully. And again, we did not provide them with any fixed criteria. They could choose for themselves, which of course made one wonder whether these people might be delusional or demented or hypomanic, and gave themselves very high rating. So we looked at other criteria. Did these people meet other criteria? We found that 94% of them were living independently, 81% had positive adaptation, 74% active engagement with life. Many of them had mastery, sense of mastery, growth, life satisfaction, high cognitive function. All of these criteria were based on some rating scale that we had used in our study. So these people not only think that they are aging successfully, but they meet the criteria for cognitive and emotional successful aging, not physically successful aging. Because if, again, as I said, that if we apply physical disease as physical disability criteria, most of them don't meet those. Second question then was, what is it that makes some people age successfully? So there are 3 kinds of things we looked at: attitudes, health-related variables, and their activities. In terms of attitude, the most important predictor was positive attitude toward aging and optimism. Also, sense of personal mastery and self-efficacy. This is kind of the Nike attitude, can do. Doesn't matter, we have these illnesses, disabilities, but we can do well. Another significant predictor was low level of perceived stress. And I want to underline the word perceived stress. If you look at the stress itself, that really did not differ much. Life events like death of a spouse, or occasionally a child, or even a death of a pet that was there for many years, death of a close friend, financial problems, physical illnesses, So many other stresses which are common in old age. All of these people had stresses. But it's a question of how they perceived the stress that differentiated them. Resilience, in general, satisfaction with life, satisfaction with social relationship, and finances. In terms of health-related variables, low level of depressive symptom was one of the most significant predictors. Most of these people were not depressed per se, but even within that, the level of depressive symptoms was low. Physical health did matter to some extent. Mental health, cognition, sleep was important too. Very important were the activities. We asked them how many days per week you spend in doing different kinds of activities. And the significant predictors were, the most significant was exercise. And exercise at any level. It could be strenuous exercise, moderate exercise, or mild exercise. Any physical activity. Even if somebody is in a wheelchair, that person can have some physical activity. If you are in a group, you can throw beach ball or move your legs, and that is physical activity. So people who did something physically, they did better than others. Computer activities. Actually, we were surprised. I mean, we thought that most of these elderly people would not be using computers. We were surprised, quite a few of them. Now, they were not exactly web surfing most of the time, but they would often exchange the pictures of their grandkids through emails, which is wonderful. Listening to radio, writing, time with friends, time organized social activities. When a group of people would go to a concert, for example, travel, and paid work. Most of the people were not doing full-time paid work. Some of them did 2 hours a day, 3 days a week, but even that really was meaningful to most of the people. In contrast, gender did not matter. Men and women, both were similar. Ethnicity did not matter. Education, income really did not make a difference. We also conducted focus group studies. We had 12 focus groups with 72 people. Jennifer Reichstadt is in the audience here, program director. She wrote a paper that was published in a journal. What we did was, these 72 people in 12 focus groups, we asked them, what is success? How do you define successful aging? And what do you think contributes to successful aging? And they stressed somewhat similar factors: attitude, social engagement, stimulation. And I'll show you some of the quotes from what they said, because sometimes the quotes mean much more than all the data that I can show you. One person said, successful aging is not a matter of chronology, as much as it is a matter of attitude and your frame of mind. Another person said, a lot of traumatic things happen in life. Set these types of traumas aside, look back at them with interest, and then move on from there. Always thinking positively. You have to be optimistic. And I said, everybody had stresses, but it is how they reacted to the stresses that was different. Without a mirror, I can't tell you how old I am. This is an 85-year-old woman. I find there are not enough hours in the day that I could get all the things done that I want to do. I'm busy probably close to 18 hours a day, doing all kinds of things that I do, like allowed to dance. I'm going to be 90 pretty soon. And this is my favorite. On my 100th birthday, I'm going to stop and think about what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. We also completed a study of qualitative interviews. We had a medical student, Geetika Sengupta. She and Jennifer Reichstadt, they worked together and interviewed 24 seniors in the community, aged from 64 to 93. And they emphasized giving to others, contributing to society, altruism, philanthropy, comfort with self, and having a sense of purpose in life, accepting change, which is inevitable with age, and then adapting to it, living in the present, seizing the moment. And some people talked about spirituality. We had looked at the data on spirituality. The data are not very clear. That's because it is sometimes hard to measure spirituality. One of our goals for research in the next few years is going to be looking at things like spirituality and how they affect successful aging. So to summarize the results of our studies, most of the study participants were aging successfully according to themselves, in spite of having physical illnesses and disability. And these self-ratings were corroborated by high scores on several other criteria, except for the physical criteria. And the contributors were positive attitude, optimism, resilience, low level of depression and perceived stress, and psychosocial and physical activities. Okay. Now, what does the literature show in terms of the biological, psychological, social predictors? Genes are clearly important. We all know that. Sometimes you see families in which number of people are living into their 80s, 90s, and even hundreds. So clearly, these are families with the right kind of genes. We published a review of what kind of genes are responsible not for just for longevity, but for successful aging. Because one can live these days, one can be on a respirator for 10 years, and that's not really successful aging. So we looked at the genes, and we found 6 genes that seem to be associated with successful aging in 2 or more studies. One of those is ApoE. Some of you may be familiar. It's associated with Alzheimer's disease. There are clearly limitations of such a literature review because most of these studies were not done in appropriate fashion for successful aging. And that's one of the things we plan to do here, where UCSD really has some of the best geneticists in the world. And having them looking at the successful aging would be really very helpful. But how important are the genes in successful aging? This was a terrific study. This was a study of about 3,000 pairs of genes. These were our veterans. And they were in their 70s. And the investigators wanted to see how much of their functioning in their 70s was determined by genes versus environment and behavior. They found that genes contributed only for 21% of the variance. Environment and behavior contributed to 78% of the variance. That means, although the genes are important in successful aging, they are not as important as we think. Their contribution is only about 20%. 80% contribution is from the environment and our behavior. We all have heard people say that the best way to live a long and successful life is to choose your parents wisely. That's actually not very true. This shows that we can't blame the parents if you don't age successfully. 80% of the blame would go to us. And likewise, 80% of the credit would go to us if we lived successfully in late life. Now, how is that possible? Because we are born with genes, and those genes are the same genes rest of our lives. How can 80% of the contribution come from environment and behavior? That is because the environment and behavior affect the expression of genes. The genes are same, but whether they express themselves depending on the environment and behavior. Good example is smoking. Let's say there are 2 people who have the same genes for lung cancer. One person smokes heavily and the other person does not smoke at all. You would expect that the person who smokes would have a much higher chance of developing lung cancer than the other person. Now, both had the same genes. It is just that smoking increases the risk of the expression of their gene, whereas if a person who did not smoke, the gene did not express itself. That's true with diet. And I will talk about calorie restriction, its importance. Hormones, we know the importance of estrogens clearly. Stress, again, number of diseases, the risk is increased because of stress. And psychosocial support. I'll show you a slide discussing the importance of that. So these are all environmental behavioral things that have important impact on how we age successfully. I want to show you couple of studies done by other people, but that are very illustrative. This was the Dutch study. What they did was they started with 545 men between the ages of 64 and 85. It's like similar to our study, starting with people over the age of 60. But they chose only those people who were free of previous cardiovascular disease or cancer. And they gave them a survey, just like we did. And they asked some questions about optimism, among other things. And then they followed these people for the next 15 years. And they wanted to find out how long these people lived. They were especially interested in deaths from cardiovascular disease. And this is what they found. They divided their sample into 3 groups. This upper line that shows the most optimistic people, those who said they were most optimistic when the study started. The lower line are the least optimistic people, and the middle line are the intermediate optimistic people. And what this shows is mortality from heart disease and other cardiovascular diseases. The most optimistic people had 1/2 the mortality of the least optimistic people from cardiovascular disease over a 15-year period. 50% difference in mortality from cardiovascular disease that was associated with optimism at baseline. And this is after controlling for other things, after controlling for age, gender, the diseases they had to start with, so on and so forth. Of course, it is not merely being optimistic. I mean, people who are optimistic, obviously, you would expect that they did exercise, they controlled their diet, they had good socialization. Nonetheless, the fact that one particular attitude or trait could differentiate people with such differences in mortality is really incredible. I mean, it shows the importance of behavior on mortality. There are a number of studies on social support, and these studies show almost consistently that social integration and social support are associated with lower mortality, protection against high blood pressure, hypertension, other cardiovascular disease, depression, and even delayed onset of dementia. So clearly, things like that have an impact in our biological functioning. Now, the things I presented to you until now were mostly in people without mental illnesses, or at least people who were not chosen for mental illnesses. Can seriously mentally ill people age successfully? I'm just going to show you a couple of examples. This is William Carlos Williams. Some of you may know of him. This is when he was 30 years old. This is when he was 65 years old. It's a really fascinating story. He was a physician and a poet. He was actually a pediatrician. He lived in New Jersey, near Princeton. He also suffered from major depression. He had his first episode of depression when he was 16, another one at 44, then 47, 67, 68, 70, 75. Not only that, but when he was 52 years old, he had a heart attack. He had a myocardial infarction. When he was in his 60s, he had a stroke. That was followed by another stroke a few years later. So if I told you that this was somebody who had suffered from depression most of his life and had a heart attack in his 50s and strokes in his 60s, you would expect that he would be absolutely miserable in his 50s and 60s. Yet, he wrote better poetry in his 50s, 60s, and 70s than he did in his earlier life. And he got Pulitzer Prize, National Book Award, Gold Medal for poetry that he wrote in his later life, not the poetry that he wrote in his younger life. He himself said that actually his poetry matured as he got older and as he developed these diseases. He had a lot of social support. He had friends, and especially his wife. After he developed stroke, actually he was paralyzed. He couldn't move his hands. And so he would dictate, and then she would type. But one reason why he did better in his later life, it's interesting, is that, as I said, he was a physician. And most of his younger lives, he spent his time in private practice, seeing patients. He did a very good job, and he was so busy that he really had no time for writing poetry. He loved writing poetry, but he had no time. When he developed these diseases, he couldn't see patients anymore. His physician practice went down, but he had all the time in the world to write poetry. So in some ways, actually, that was a blessing in disguise for him as a poet. Another story about somebody with schizophrenia. How many of you have seen Beautiful Mind? Yeah, most of you have. It's a great movie. And it's almost a true story. Hollywood always takes liberties with, but by and large, it's really inspiring story. Somebody who was diagnosed with schizophrenia at the age of 30, although probably he had it since the age of 20. And for 30 years, he was treated with various treatments, medications, ECT, insulin coma, and what have you. Started getting better in his 50s. And at the age of 60, he went back to research, went back to teaching. Of course, the Nobel Prize he got was for the work that he had done in his 20s. But the important thing is that he became a scientist again after 30 years of schizophrenia. Last year, he was the keynote speaker for the American Psychiatric Association. Just imagine somebody with schizophrenia being a keynote speaker for the world's largest psychiatrist association. Now, you might say that William Carlos Williams and John Nash, these are geniuses. I mean, so they may remit in later life, but what about the average Joe? We did a study a few years ago of older people with schizophrenia who live in the community. And we found that 10% of them have sustained remission or recovery from schizophrenia. 10% is not a large percentage, but 10% is much better than zero. Because most people think that schizophrenia is a life sentence. If you have a schizophrenia, then you're going to have schizophrenia the rest of your life. This shows that that's not the case, at least in 10%. And who were those 10%? Looks like these were people who were married. Importantly, these are people who had a lot of social support. Again, the importance of social support you see here also. They had good treatment most of their lifetime. So what it makes you think is that if our healthcare system improved, and if we provided good care to our patients, and if we provided them with social support, instead of 10%, that proportion could go to 50%, maybe even 90%. But that really changes the whole idea about living successfully in old age in spite of physical illnesses and mental illnesses. Last but not least, the neuroplasticity and strategies for successful aging. What is our usual notion about what happens to brain and cognition as we get older? When I went to medical school, I was taught that most of the development of the brain occurred in the first few years of life. Actually, the growth of the skull occurs in the first 2 years of life. The size of the head does not increase after the 2 years, although the brain still keeps on changing in the first few years until through the adolescence. There is formation and loss of some neurons and synapses and so on. After that, it is pretty stable. And in old age, the only thing that can happen is loss of neurons, loss of synapses, and decrease in functioning. And that is also reflected in cognition. That's what we were taught. So cognition means things like memory, learning, some kind of intelligence, for example. And the cognition clearly improves in the first few years of life. Then it stays stable, and then it goes down. And there's nothing you can do. That's the usual notion about aging and cognition. This is actually what the literature, when you look at the research, this is what it shows, that some types of cognition goes down, some types of cognition do not go down with age. For example, most of us, as we get older, we have difficulty remembering names of people. For example, there may be a friend I saw 15 years ago, and I see him, and I just can't remember his name. But if you give me a list of 5 names, I will recognize his name spontaneously. What that means is that the memory of his name is stored quite well in my brain even now. It is just I had difficulty in accessing that information. So it is not that my memory is going downhill. The memory is still there. The difficulty is in accessing that memory. So that is what is crystallized versus fluid. Fluid is accessing, so that goes down. But the memory store itself is fine. That's a crystallized pragmatics. So some things are inevitable, almost inevitable with aging. We all slow down as we grow older. Physically also, if you could do some crossword puzzle, for example, in 15 minutes at the age of 25, at the age of 65, it might take 25 minutes, half an hour or so, or longer than that. However, we can still do it. That's the point. Now, can any abilities improve with aging? Vocabulary can, if you keep on reading and writing and you are in touch with the vocabulary. The studies have shown, for example, that people in their 60s who are cognitively active have better vocabulary than young adults in their 20s. Domain-specific knowledge. What is domain-specific knowledge? These are things in which we have spent our lifetime doing. For example, I'm a researcher, so I know something about research. I know something about writing papers and grants and thinking about what hypotheses to propose and how to test them. I can do that much better now than I could do 20 years ago. So there are some other things which I'm much worse at. For example, learning the new computer skills. My daughter, who is in the audience, she can do much better than I can any day. But how to write paper grant or how to think about research, that I can do much better now. So that kind of domain-specific knowledge improves with aging. And something called wisdom, which is actually not typically included in empirical biological research. And I hope that really, not I hope, we actually plan to do some research of that kind at the Stein Institute over the next several years. What is wisdom? And so actually, younger colleague of mine, Ipsit Wahi, and I, we looked at wisdom in the modern literature, mostly modern Western literature. And in the last 30 years, there have been quite a few papers on wisdom. There was actually a wonderful article on wisdom in the New York Times Sunday supplement published a few months ago. If you can access it, please read it. It's a great article. But the Western research on wisdom is relatively recent, started in the mid-70s. We looked at the concept of wisdom in what is called the Bhagavad Gita. This is like the Indian Hindu Bible. This was written 2,000 years BC. It's written in Sanskrit, but there are English translation. And what we wanted to do was, we wanted to find out how wisdom was defined. And again, it was not one specific definition, but sort of the components of things that were included in wisdom, the Gita. And we were surprised to find so many similarities between wisdom that was described 2,000 years BC in the remote part of the world compared to what here we think today. Rich knowledge of life, emotional regulation, equanimity, where you don't get ruffled easily with different things. Insight, which really means humility. You become aware of how much you don't know rather than how much you know. Focus on common good, compassion, altruism, decisiveness. We often face situations where there is no clear-cut solution, and we have to choose between difficult alternatives, and yet the wise people do something decisively. And last but not least, is self-contentedness. You can always complain about what you don't have, or you can be happy with what you have. But the point here is that wisdom does not look like a cultural concept. It's not some modern concept restricted to some parts of the world, but it has been there. in human history probably throughout, which makes you think that it's probably a biologically based concept. And if so, why is it that some people have it, more of it, and others don't? And so that's really something we hope to study over the next several years, looking not just psychology and sociology, but also biology of wisdom. Okay. I think the most important discovery in neuroscience in the last 15 years is neuroplasticity of aging. What is plasticity? Plastic is something that is moldable, so something that changes. So the question, can brain change with aging? Can brain change in old age? Again, as I said, most of us were brought up thinking in the medical field, thinking that no, there is no such thing as neuroplasticity of aging. There is plasticity in childhood. I mean, if you have a 10-year-old child who has a major head injury, the child can recover from that. And we all know that that's fine because the child is still growing and the brain is growing. What now we find is that may be true also of older people. Number of studies actually done here in La Jolla at UCSD, Salk, Scripps, Burnham. Dr. Fred Gage, Rusty Gage, is really one of the major researchers in this area at Salk and UCSD. Here also people like A.D. Ko and several others, Mark Tuchinski, who are doing important research in this area. What people find is that neurogenesis, that is development of new neurons, continues to occur in old age. It doesn't occur in every part of the brain. It occurs only in some parts. For example, it occurs in what is called the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus. But that's just fascinating, that even in some part of the brain, new neurons can form in old age. It's really mind-boggling. And what is important is that this neurogenesis is stimulated by living in an enriched environment. I told you that some people do well in their older age than others, or people start doing better in old age than they did before. Why is it? Because on the one hand, there is clearly some decline in brain functioning that occurs. So the theory is that there is maybe better utilization of the brain networks. Another theory is that there is recruitment of additional networks as needed. I will explain to you that in this slide. This is a study that was published a few years ago. This study compared 3 groups of people. Young adults who could do a memory task well. One group of old people who could not do that task well, and a group of old people who did that task as well as young people. Okay, so those are the 3 groups. Young people, old people with low functioning, old people with high functioning. And by functioning, I mean memory in this case. They did an fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. While the person was under the magnet, they gave this memory task, and they looked at the activity of the brain in specific area. This is the prefrontal cortex. That's what they looked at. And these are the areas, the red areas are those areas where there was increased activity. So what they found was that in young people, there is increased activation of prefrontal cortex only on one side of the brain. In old people who did not do their task well, increased activation only on one side of the brain. Old people who did the task well, there's activation on both sides of the brain. In other words, they needed both sides of the brain to do the same thing that a younger person could do with only one side. It is like when I was 20 years old, I could push a heavy cart with one hand. Now I have to push it with both hands, but I can do it with 2 hands. Something like that. So that's the theory, is that as you get older, you can do well if you use more of your brain to do that. Here, Lisa Eiler, one of our younger colleagues, she's doing a similar study. And this is the preliminary stages, but the findings are very similar, that older people who do the task well, looks like more of their brain is involved, more of their neuronal networks are involved in the activity. There is one study that is really fascinating that I want to show you. This was a study that was published in Nature, #1 journal in science. What the investigators did in this study was they took some young adults. Although this was a study of young adults, I think this will also apply to older people. They took the young adults and divided them into two groups. One group was taught how to juggle 3 balls at a time. That was a criterion for juggling, 3 balls at a time. And they had to practice that for 3 months. And then they became expert in doing that. The other group was told not to try juggling. And they did their MRI at baseline. They did the MRI after 3 months of juggling. Then they asked people to stop juggling and again repeated the MRI 3 months later. What they found was in people who did not juggle, there was no change in their brain activity, in the brain structure. So people who did not juggle, there was no change from baseline to 3 months to 6 months. People who juggled, there was significant increase in the gray matter of certain parts of parietal and temporal lobe that were involved in anticipation. Juggling involves anticipation. You need to know where the ball is going to land, and you put your hand there. But this is really incredible, because what they found was a significant increase in the gray matter of the brain that you could see in an MRI. So it has to be really pretty gross change in order to be able to see with a crude measure like MRI. So if something as simple as juggling 3 balls at a time, practicing that, can increase the gray matter in some part of the brain, you can imagine how much impact, if we exercise regularly, will have on the brain. So how can we all age successfully? Actually, I want to start with something that I hate to present, but it is true. Calorie restriction is the most evidence-based way for successful aging. So forget about whatever you ate outside. But this is one strategy that has been shown to be valid in every single animal species that has been studied, from the lowest animals to the highest ones. And what they recommend is intermittent fasting with plenty of water. I should add that I'm not talking about malnutrition. Clearly, we're not talking about teenagers or some of those fashion models who starve themselves to death. We're not talking about that. We're talking about people who are in good health. But what happens for most of us, that if we can do with 1,500 calories a day, most of us eat 2,500 calories a day. Not because we need them, but because we like to eat. And so that's really the calorie restriction that is helpful. Physical exercise, I'll talk about that. Non-toxic environment, cessation of smoking, optimizing stress. I've underlined the word optimizing because the goal is not elimination of stress. For one thing, it will never be possible. We cannot eliminate stress. But even if it were possible, I don't think it will be ideal. It is good to have some stress. It has been shown even at the cellular level that stress produces something called stress inoculation, that the cells that are stressed are actually better able to handle traumas or insults later on. Then there is something called superfoods. Things like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, spinach, carrots, blueberries, vitamin E, spices like curcumin. These are rich in antioxidants. And these antioxidants serve as free radical scavengers, and they reduce the cellular damage. So how do these various strategies that I mentioned work? Right from calorie restriction to exercise to the superfoods. They reduce the catabolism, that is breakdown of fat. They increase the catabolism or breakdown of fats, reduce the blood glucose levels, not just in blood, but rest of the body, and the various other ways in which they have significant biological effects at the cellular level. Just a couple of studies I want to show you in humans. This is a study of calorie restriction in people. just published in Journal of American Medical Association. 48 overweight but not obese people who are otherwise healthy but sedentary. What they did was they divided them into 4 groups. And the bottom line is this, that people with calorie restriction had significant improvement in 2 of the biological markers of longevity: fasting insulin and core body temperature and DNA damage. Really, we won't know about longevity unless you follow these people for the next 30 years. But in a short period of time, you can look at some biomarkers that are associated with longevity. So even in a relatively short period of a few months, you could see significant difference. What about physical activity? This has been shown, as I said, in animals as well as humans. This was a study in mice. What the investigators did was they divided mice into 2 groups. One is old mice. One group of old mice was brought up in the usual cages. So these are the mice who spend 24/7 inside the cage. They are given food and water. They don't have to do anything. And this group of mice was brought up in a kind of Disneyland for mice. So they could roam around, different colors, and so they had actually a lot of things to choose from. So there was actually mental as well as physical stimulation. And what they found was that these mice brought up in the Disneyland had significantly better structure and function of the brain compared to the mice in the usual cages. A number of studies in humans have supported that. Actually, here at UCSD, Dr. Kevin Patrick from Department of Family and Preventive Medicine is one of the national experts in this area. Studies show that any kind of activity is useful. There is somewhat more research on aerobic or cardiovascular fitness, but again, any kind of increase in physical activity is helpful, not just physically, but also psychologically. Yeah. In terms of psychosocial strategies, stimulating environment, positive attitude, learning new skills, and some cognitive enhancing strategies are useful. One thing to stress is it is never too early. Aging starts at conception. So it could not be too early. But also, by the same token, development continues into old age. We used to think that development is something childhood related, and aging is something related to old age. That's not true. Aging starts from conception, but development continues into old age. And there are some studies of memory enhancement. There's another study that was funded by NIH, very large study of nearly 3,000 independent living seniors. And the bottom line here is that the sessions that were meant to improve cognition not only improved cognition, but also improved instrumental activities of daily living. Again, these studies have limitations, but clearly they show that there are ways in which one can improve the cognitive and physical functioning. So in summary, successful cognitive and emotional aging is common. It's not primarily dependent on physical health. Behavior and environment have a greater impact than heredity. And successful aging is possible even in people with physical illness or mental illness, provided that people receive optimal treatment, including psychosocial stimulation and support. Thank you for your attention.